Good day and welcome to this Huntington Learning Center webinar, Making the Most of the College Search. This is a great event for all of you parents and for, of course, you seniors and juniors looking to get into college. I'm Michael Hackmer, your moderator for today's event, and on behalf of Huntington Learning Center, I want to say thank you so much for making time to join us. We know there's a lot going on, so we certainly appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. Now, before I introduce our speaker, Jeff Selingo, I want to talk a little bit about Huntington Learning Center. So if you're familiar with Huntington at all, you'll know that Huntington's been around for over 45 years, and we're a leading tutoring and test prep organization that serves students in grades K through 12. Now, there are three things that I really love about Huntington that really differentiate Huntington from other tutoring or test prep centers or just going out and hiring someone to help your student perform better on tests. And the first thing is that everything we do is taught by a highly trained and certified tutor. And we think that that training and certification is really important to make sure that they're able to best address the needs of your child. Huntington is also accredited. And the third, and I think probably most important piece, is Huntington uses a targeted and individualized approach to developing all of our learning programs. So we get students in, we do a full assessment, because while everybody maybe has similar struggles in math or in English or study skills or test prep, at the end of the day, every student has slightly different strengths and weaknesses. They learn a little bit differently. And we really want to make sure that how we approach the educational experience with your child best meets their needs. And really, I think the results do speak for themselves. In just about 3 months, typically on average, Huntington students see an increase of 2.2 grade levels in reading and in math. And then when you look at the exam prep, the SAT or the ACT prep programs that we run, on average, you're looking at an increase of 229 points on the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT. So certainly very significant. And then we also do a lot in terms of helping students with scholarship offers. Huntington students have averaged over $71,000 in scholarship offers. So I think over the last year, that total across all students was somewhere around $187 million. So definitely significant. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Jeff Selingo. So Jeff has participated in webinars with us in the past, and he is really one of the foremost experts when it comes to the college admissions process. He's authored 3 books on higher education, including 2 New York Times bestsellers. Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions was named one of the 100 most notable books in 2020 by New York Times. And of course, he's a contributor across the board, whether it's the Atlantic, the Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And we get to have Jeff as our speaker tonight. He's going to get a chance to guide us through the world of college admissions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jeff. Jeff?
Michael, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us this evening. If you've been part of our webinars before, we're going to do something a little bit different tonight. We're going to be talking to people in admissions who are on campuses, admissions leaders at 3 different universities, so that you can hear directly from them what they're looking for and help to guide you through this process. I would imagine that many on the webinar tonight are mostly probably sophomores and juniors in high school. We might have some younger parents of younger students as well, and we may even have some seniors. So we're going to try to have a number of different questions that hit all of those audiences. So we'll talk a little bit about this year, but we'll also be looking forward to next year for those on the call who have students who are juniors and below. So I'm really excited to welcome 3 great admissions leaders to be with us tonight. As you can see on the screen in front of you, we have Rick Clark, who is returning to be on this webinar with me. He's been on a previous webinars with us. He's Executive Director for Strategic Student Access at Georgia Tech. He's been there for 20 years and most recently directed undergraduate admissions there. He's also the co-author of The Truth About College Admission, a family guide to staying in and staying together, a great book, by the way, with Brennan Bernard. And he's also co-host of a podcast that is of the same name, and he also writes a blog for Georgia Tech's admissions. Also with us tonight is Aaron Veride. who is Associate Director of Admissions at Florida State University. She's been at Florida State in a variety of roles for 11 years, and she's responsible for application review, scholarship activities, as well as research for the Office of Admissions. And then finally, we have with us tonight Ben Toll, who's Director of Undergraduate Admissions at George Washington University. And he's been in a variety of roles for 12 years in GW admissions. He's also worked in undergraduate admissions at St. Mary's College of Maryland and the University of Minnesota at Morris. So we have two public universities, one private university in different states, different regions of the country. So I think that tonight you're going to get a really good indication of how admissions works at these different places, but also more broadly as well, because all of these admissions leaders with us have a really good, really deep experience in admissions. We're going to be talking about a number of different issues tonight, but as Michael mentioned earlier, please add your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. And so basically how the night will be laid out, our next 45 minutes or so together before we get to questions, we're going to be talking about lessons from this year. If you have a senior or you know seniors, you know that this year was a little crazier than normal in the college admissions world. There's been a lot of news about testing and SAT and ACT recently in the news. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for testing, especially again, if you have a junior, sophomore, or younger student. We're going to be talking about the importance of courses and grades and how they play into college admissions. Then we're going to be talking about kind of the mechanics of putting together your list. How do you determine the ROI of a college or a degree as you're putting together that list? And we're going to be talking about something that I think many of you are starting to do, whether you're doing it now during spring breaks or you're going to do it during the summer or maybe even this fall, and that is the college tour. And how do you get the most out of the college tour? So we have a lot of topics tonight. I'm hoping that we're going to answer most of your questions, and I'm really excited to dive into deep into the subject with this great panel that we have with us tonight. Rick, Aaron, and Ben, welcome to this webinar.
Thanks for having us. Looking forward to it.
Good to be here.
Yeah, happy to be here and share what's going on in this fun process.
Great. Well, Ben, let's start with you because applications were up across the board in higher ed this year across colleges and universities, according to the Common App. This led to a lot of institutions with more denials, deferrals, and early decision and wait lists. Could you tell us a little bit, and I'm going to ask Aaron this as well, how did this play out at your institution? Actually, I'm going to ask all three of you this question. How did this year play out at your institution? And Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah, for us at GW, this has been a really great year for us, mostly because we've been working with this class in person for the last 2 years, right? The prior classes were doing part of their college search, or if not all of their college search, more in a virtual fashion. And so when we're working with these applicants, many of them have had just a greater level of understanding as they chose the colleges to apply to. I think one of the things that you see many schools kind of really struggling with is they have these great pools of applicants. They have more, some limitations on capacity. And so they're trying to think about creative ways to still offer opportunities, but, and perhaps maybe a admissions response that the family wasn't expected. So obviously some students are being admitted, some students are being waitlisted or denied, but more offers of joining the institution in the spring semester, or perhaps starting your educational career overseas and then coming back to the institution. And, this is us trying to get to kind of fine levels of, we know actually we're going to have 100 extra beds in January because our current students are more likely to study abroad in the spring than the fall, and create some, housing inefficiencies. And so, that family might get that offer, and it might be initially kind of puzzling to them, but it's actually us trying to find ways to say yes within the constraints of, a set number of beds, set number of seats. But again, increasing demand out there for the type of education we offer.
Okay. And Aaron, how did this play out at Florida State? I know, again, you had a huge increase in applications. I know that I talked to some counselors in Florida who used to think that Florida State might be a target school for some of their students, and this year it wasn't as much of a target school for their students. Could you talk a little bit about how this year played out at Florida State and how it differed from previous years in particular?
Sure. I've been saying this, I think, every year for the past 7 years, but we had a record number of applications to FSU. This year, I think we came in at 79,000. And our number of admitted students did not increase for our size of our enrolled class over the past couple years. So been really hit the nail on the head of trying to find those kind of creative ways to get positive decisions to students who really do want to be here at our school. But it does result ultimately in more students ultimately being denied. I will say that we do not currently use a wait list at Florida State, but I know there's murmurings happening at schools across the state, and there's still some calls to try and move to that approach that we're trying to fend off.
And Rick, how about at Georgia Tech? And I guess more so for those who have juniors or sophomores or younger students on the call, like how much is this year, first of all, how much was it really different than the last couple of years? And even looking forward, do you think this is like the new normal at Georgia Tech and even among some of the other institutions that you know well?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we saw an increase in applications. I wouldn't say it's too dissimilar than what we had seen in prior years. So, there was an increase. It was a double-digit percentage increase, but we've had plenty of those over the last decade plus. So, nothing too abnormal there in terms of overall interest. And we are increasing our class size and have been steadily doing that by about 100 per year. So, it's not keeping up with demand, but making that attempt. I guess looking ahead and looking sort of broadly, I do think that, for instance, the 3 schools represented here and many schools like us that have, that national brand, either are in cities or are either, especially like Southern flagships or Florida State's case, sort of, right there's an extremely well-known Southern public. I mean, these are just places that are going to continue to draw applications, not only from their states, which are growing, but also from around the country for a variety of reasons. Everything from the return on investment piece to just, again, that sort of well-branded national reach concept. So in those places, I think the story hasn't really changed, and the story probably won't, here in the years ahead.
And I think not to tell folks on the call tonight not to apply to any of your institutions, but I think there's clearly a remapping of the college admissions landscape going on. And that, I think folks who, working with their counselor, their high school counselor, really trying to have a balanced list and knowing that some schools that, 5-10 years ago might have been more target schools for your child may now be more of a reach. And I like to remind people that there are, hundreds and hundreds, actually a couple thousand institutions. But even if we're talking about 4-year institutions, talking about institutions that are comprehensive, like any of these universities that are on the call tonight, we're still talking about hundreds of institutions. So there's plenty of places out there, plenty of institutions that are are a good fit for students. And so, kind of thinking about your list in a balanced way, I think is pretty important. I want to talk about one other thing from this year, and then we'll talk about kind of these other aspects of admissions. And one of them is the FAFSA. If you're a senior parent on this call tonight, you probably have heard a lot about this. If you're a junior or below, you may have been seeing headlines about it. And so I'm kind of curious about if the FAFSA is the federal application for student aid, the free application for federal student aid. It has been simplified drastically, which is the good news. The bad news is that the rollout of this has been, in my words, a disaster. And so I'm kind of curious, and Ben, maybe I'll get some of your thoughts on this, and Aaron. Is this just I know nobody can really predict for next year. If I'm a parent and I'm a junior on this call and my kid's a junior, is this something that I should kind of be prepared for next year? Or do you have some confidence that these things will get worked out? Again, nobody I know can predict the future, but how are you feeling about that? And Ben, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously been very troubling as we try to support students and families through this process. You know, at GW, we developed our own alternative process. So we were actually able to go out with financial aid packages the same day we released decisions. But to families, even if GW's done them right, they're trying to compare and they're trying to figure out, okay, I know what my affordability looks like at GW, but what about these 3 other schools? And there's almost a sense of paralysis of how do they start making decisions. You know, I would say that while we are not out of the woods here, things are moving forward. And I think for families that are juniors and sophomores, this should be ironed out by the time you go through the process. But you need to educate yourself, because even if you had older children go through this process, the formula has changed and how need is being calculated. And it has some pretty dramatic impacts, especially for those families that have multiple students in college at the same time. And so you want to be doing that advanced research, getting to understand this. What does it mean as you're kind of building your financial aid, your financial plan? You know, Jeff, you were talking about, you know, as families build, you know, these lists of schools and, you know, trying to say, okay, here are some reach schools, here are some target schools, here are some safety schools. But the same applies for some schools might be a financial reach, right? Some schools might be a financial safety. And so you kind of have to develop your list with kind of both the admissions chances, Lance, perspective, but also the financial perspective of here are some schools where I think I have a, you know, affordability is really going to come down to whether they give me a merit scholarship or not, versus, oh, this is a school that I know is a little bit more aggressive on aid. And so, you know, those are things to think about as you build that list out.
Yeah, I think, Ben, a critically important point that when we talk about fit, we don't just mean academic fit, we don't just mean social fit, but we also mean financial fit. Aaron, how about at Florida State? How are you feeling about the FAFSA now? And is this something, as Ben pointed out, that hopefully will be fixed from a mechanics point of view for next year, but that, as he pointed out, if you had older children who went through this process, there could be a dramatic change in what you potentially could get from institutions based on the changes that were made to the FAFSA.
Yeah, I really, really hope that this is just a year of trouble and trauma and that it doesn't carry over. We are starting to see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, but the financial aspect of going to college is vital to student success. And I hate the insecurity that this year's class and continuing students are feeling, because financial security is physical well-being, and it's hard to concentrate on the other things when that is threatened. But that being said, I do hope some of the resources and support that were sort of panic implemented, if you will, in this sort of instance stick around in future years. I'm thinking like the Department of Education support resources that, you know, may be helpful, and things like we're in right now, the FAFSA Week of Action. I just think continuing to pour resources into this area, even in a non-panicked year, would really help continue in the long run.
Okay. Want to move on to testing. And Rick, I know this past couple of weeks we've seen institutions like Harvard and Caltech and Yale and UT Austin returning to the test. Georgia Tech, I know, requires test scores, as does Florida State. Can you talk a little bit about the testing environment? Because this has been again, if you have a junior now and you have a sophomore, it feels like this is kind of a moving target constantly. Do you think things are starting to settle out now, 4 years after the pandemic? What type of strategy might families come up with if they are a sophomore or a junior now as they think about the test?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have to be reminded that this is the time of year you're going to hear those announcements. You're not going to hear these announcements in November or January. So, some of what seems like a lot, or the constant, today there's another one, like it's going to happen in this tightly packed window. So that is to be expected. To your point, I mean, obviously there have been some schools going back this year that had been on, I guess, observation and kind of data review in the last couple of years. But I think what most families should expect in the years ahead is kind of continued variance. I think that would be what I would sign up for. Actually, I will sign up for that. I'm a freshman in high school. So, I think what I would be telling families, what I've been telling, neighbors and friends who have kids in high school is there's value in taking these tests. Because at the end of the day, as parents, what we want for our kids, whether they're 3 or 13 or any other ages, for them to have choices and options. And to me, the whole goal of college admission is not getting into a certain place, but making sure that when you're a senior at some point, whether it be in the fall or in the spring, that you have choices and options. You get to choose where you go. You get to pick between a couple places. And right now, you're better off going ahead and taking these tests so that when it comes time to apply, you're not having doors closed to you because you don't have the test. The other thing there is, a lot of people wonder how these random, brochures show up in their mailbox. And a lot of that is because they have taken tests of some kind. They've taken an SAT or ACT, they've taken an AP exam and, made a certain score. And we on the college side use that to build our pipelines. So even if you don't ultimately need it, right? Because, as a reminder, the vast majority of four-year schools in the country currently do not require tests. And I don't see that percentage swinging much here in the years ahead. So you may apply to only schools. Let's say you apply to 7 schools. It could be that none of them require tests. There could still be value there for you, however, in that you hear from various schools, you, again, keep those options open. And then when it comes to potentially scholarships, merit aid, honors programs, et cetera, you have the test score should you need it.
Good advice there, Rick. So Ben, I want to, as a representative of an institution on this webinar tonight that is test optional, right? So we're a school where you accept scores if students want to submit them. Can you talk a little bit about how you use test scores in your review, where you have some applicants with test scores and some without?
Yeah, absolutely. As we go through our application review, there are so many different factors that we are looking at, within the transcript, within their curriculum, their testing, if it's available. And as we made that transition, because, I was with GW and trained the staff as we made that transition, there was so much anxiety about like, well, how am I going to review this file without it? And at the end of the day, for many, many students, the majority of students, their testing and their academic performance is actually highly correlated. And so, if you do that review, and then the test is like one of the latter components of the review, it's almost like you get to that page, oh, that was what I was expecting, right? And sometimes it's a little bit maybe higher than you're expecting, maybe it's a little bit lower than you're expecting, but it's not shocking, it's not surprising, right? And and sometimes I feel like, a family will ask a question about, do you prefer to see X? And that could be testing, that could be an extracurricular. And sometimes, we provide an answer to try to be direct, but sometimes our answer gets misinterpreted too. You could ask me, do you like to see students who are Eagle Scouts? Of course we do. Now, if you're not an Eagle Scout, does that mean you have no chance of admission? Of course not, right? And so that's kind of to me, kind of how testing is, right? It can be a factor. It can have that positive influence on an application. But the fact that a student doesn't have testing does not automatically lead us to doubt and ask, well, why don't they have it, right? At this point, for our institution, it's almost an exact 50-50 split between who's applying with testing and who's applying without testing. And it's, it's just, I would say we've become bilingual in how we read applications, and we're able to jump whether the students got testing or not, or whether the students in an AP curriculum or an IB curriculum. It's just, for us, we see thousands of applications over the years and are able to make those adjustments.
That's a great way to think about it, bilingual. And I think it's also important to remember, by the way, we were talking about testing in admissions, but some institutions look at testing in terms of scholarships as well. So it's something to ask during the college search about how they might use testing to determine scholarship aid. I think is critical. So I want to move on to courses and grades because we know they play a critical role, obviously. The high school transcript plays a critical role in admissions. And as I said earlier, we probably have mostly sophomores and juniors on this call, maybe even some parents and students who are first year in high school. So I want to just do a quick lightning round with all three of you. What's the one thing you would recommend to them in terms of what they can do now in high school so they don't have any regrets about when they're applying? And I know you're probably talking to somebody who's in 9th, 10th, or 11th grade. So I know it's a pretty broad range. And I know if you're in 9th grade, you have a lot more time to do something than an 11th grader does now, just a couple months of school, if that, left. But Rick, let me start with you. Even pick a year if you want, since I know you have a 9th grader at home, or even any of the 9th or 10th or 11th graders. Like, what's the one thing they can do now in high school so they don't have regrets later on when they're applying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big thing is to challenge yourself. But I think that's always a balance, right? I mean, ultimately, what is the goal? In my opinion, at least for my own family, it is going to be to show up somewhere prepared and healthy. That's my goal for my kids, right? Not a particular place, not even a particular set of places, but to go through a high school experience where you're actually learning and you are preparing well for college when you get there. And doing that in a manner where you're actually enjoying your high school experience and getting to do things not solely studying. So I mean, personally, my recommendation is to decide for you, and that's going to vary for every student, what can you handle? What is a challenge to you? At what point are you just overloading and not either A, enjoying, or B, actually learning? And ultimately, how are you going to best be prepared and healthy when you get there? To me, a kid finishes high school then feeling like, no, they didn't miss out on any opportunities. They did what they were supposed to do. They got prepared to go to college. They're going to have choices and options. And when they get there, they're going to have a solid foundation to do well, both emotionally, as well as academically.
Okay. Aaron, how about you? Any advice on, what's the one thing a 9th or 10th or 11th grader can do right now?
This hits home for me because I spoke with a family just last night who was just absolutely convinced that their son's chances to get into college were ruined because of a class in 8th grade. And I'm talking, this is an 8th grade student, because they were now off the track needed to be X, Y, or Z in college. So just a lot of our conversations, I think, as admissions professionals are telling people to take a deep breath. We say take your curriculum progression and grades seriously in early high school and throughout all of high school. But FSU, one of the things we do check for is grade trends. If there are some less than stellar grades on the transcript early on, because we know that everyone is human and there's some grace extended for that high school transition, especially one thing we do is know where COVID falls into each cycle's high school experience. We have a lot of conversations about that in training. You know, what was the experience of these students at this time? How were they learning likely? But we also say start thinking about the majors that they may be interested in and have an idea of what the schools that you might be interested in require for those majors. Like, don't all of a sudden become passionate for a STEM major at an institution that clearly states they want to see calculus at a minimum and your current math track has you in pre-calc your senior year. So we say challenge yourself, educate yourself, but don't burn yourself out.
Okay. Ben, how about you? Any one piece of advice now that you would have for 9th, 10th, and 11th graders?
Yeah, I think the big thing is to understand that when done well, the college application process is building a portfolio. And no matter where you are in your journey towards this process, there are parts of that portfolio that are already set in stone. They are the past and the history. And there are parts that you still control either through your future actions or how you choose to present them to us. And, you know, going back to our previous conversation on testing, like in America, we love to freak out about that topic. And at some point, you're just gonna say, my test score is my test score. Let me focus my energy on the parts of my application that I can impact. And so whether, you know, you're in 10th grade, that means 9th grade is in the books, and we're gonna make the most of our course selections and things like that going forward. There's always a chance to make a positive impact on your application, but worrying about the things that have already occurred, you know, is a distraction from you at that point.
Okay. Ben, let's stay with you for a minute and talk about specifically the transcript. What are you looking for when you open up or you look at your admissions officers look at the transcript? What are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, you know, throughout the year, our staff travel the country, travel the world, and people think they're recruiting students, but in reality, they're coming to understand these different regions, the different schools, the different curriculum. In order to evaluate a transcript, you have to understand the context of that school, right? I grew up in Rhode Island, and if you took an AP class, it was AP US History junior year with Mrs. Gardner. That was non-negotiable. There were no other options. And then maybe you took some more, you know, your senior year versus, you know, I'm here in Maryland right now where we have students that are applying into a program, they're 8th grade, they take their first AP class freshman year and they take 8 more before they graduate, right? So we can't be comparing apples and oranges out there. And so it's our expectation of our teams is to develop that granular knowledge, to make relationships with the counselors at the high schools to understand what is the trajectory of students through this process. And so that when we dig into that transcript, we come with that background and knowledge. You know, you'll hear people talk about an admissions committee. You know, the person who knows that high school best is educating the rest of the committee on these curriculum frameworks and such. And so then we can get in and we can understand course progressions. We can understand the trends that Aaron was talking about earlier. We can understand as they're stepping up into different levels of rigor, you know, how their grades react to those changes. You know, everything has to be contextualized in this process. You know, in my admitted class, and it's actually probably, this is the smallest number of the panel, there's over 4,500 high schools represented in the admitted class. All those high schools are innovating on their own, and it's our responsibility in order to do this process well is to get to know those schools, get to know those curriculums, so that we can really evaluate students based on the world that they were, you know, engaged with during their high school years.
Okay. Aaron, you mentioned math, and, you know, it's a question that I get probably more from parents and students than almost any other question around the math curriculum. It seems like colleges are really asking for a lot in math. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you look for at Florida State in math and why, and might it differ depending on what an applicant might major in? Because I think math is also a subject that, well, Ben was talking about a couple thousand high schools. It is one thing that's a little bit more similar when schools have access to, you know, a full math curriculum where there is a sequence, and that sequence kind of starts usually in 8th grade. So can you talk a little bit about what you look for in math and why, and does it differ by what an applicant might major in?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't have strict requirements or preferences. Talking again about like calculus, knowing that educational opportunities differ for students. Particularly, looking at the state of Florida, we know kind of those areas there where a student basically has to have an act of Congress to be able to get into a calculus course. But we also don't review applications specifically for entry into a major. So some schools who do might have different processes for that. But the only time we do that at Florida State is with some of our audition programs like music or dance. So what we do is we look for rigor of curriculum in context of the educational opportunities available for students at their school, where they live, where they learn. And then we like to see continued progression throughout the high school career. So there isn't necessarily a minimum that you have to reach, within reason. But it is a red flag when we get to the senior year and your courses are 5 electives and a sociology course. So we want to see you to continue to challenge yourself in a healthy way, because that effort and that preparation is going to need to continue into college.
Okay. I want to talk, Rick, about one other part of the application beyond the transcript, and then we'll move on to other issues. There's recommendations, there's essays, there's activities. Any sense to our audience tonight, do you have a priority order of their importance at a place like Georgia Tech? And are you looking for something specific in each of these pieces?
Yeah, I would say that probably the biggest thing once you move past, like Aaron just said, what were the courses that a student could have taken, did take, and how did they do in those classes? I mean, really, that is the number one thing, whether you require test scores or not. Rigor of curriculum, performance in high school, trends, all of that is the most important thing. At the end of the day, kid is coming to be a student at your school. That's what matters the most. But going past that, I would say for us at Georgia Tech, and I'd be curious certainly to hear what my colleagues tonight say, but what I feel like I often hear colleagues say is the next thing would be their impact outside, the classroom. And in our book, we do talk a lot about this, like involvement, influence, and impact. And why does that matter? I mean, not only because they're going to come and be a community member, right? In addition to a student, they're going to be a community member, and you want to get a sense of what they will be like as a community member, what kind of impact they'll have on your own campus. But ultimately, too, I mean, and anybody on the call tonight who's already been to college knows this, like, it's one thing to be smart and to be talented academically. It's a whole different thing to like manage the freedom of college and be able to figure out how to, juggle competing priorities. And one of the things I will just say at Georgia Tech, infer a bit is if you have been involved and deeply so, and especially over a period of time, then you've figured a lot of that out. Not just how to be a good student, but how to manage your time and go beyond just the academic piece. So I would say for us anyway, that would be the next thing after academics.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about putting the list together, because if you're a junior or a sophomore or a ninth grader, you're going to start thinking about this. As I mentioned earlier, there are thousands of colleges in the U.S. Even if we think about four-year colleges that enroll over 1,000 students, we're still talking about a list of probably about 1,200 colleges. So Ben, like, where should families even start to put together that list?
Yeah, my recommendation, and it's a little bit self-serving because it's a little bit of a challenge that we have, is actually to start with your backyard. This
Right.
process of visiting schools, quite honestly, can get quite expensive, right? And most, you think about where you live, you might have access to a regional flagship or you could maybe have a liberal arts college just down the road. You maybe have an urban school, a little bit more of a rural school, and you can use them as samples of the types of schools you might be interested in. So if I just use where I live, right? I'm right now a quarter mile from the University of Maryland. I'm 7 miles from GW. I am 30 miles from Washington College on the Eastern Shore. By doing those 3 visits first, my student's going to be able to see 3 completely different styles and get a sense for, what are they truly looking for in this college experience. And then you say, oh, like, I think my student really fits in that liberal arts college environment. Okay, now let's start thinking about which liberal arts colleges might be good fits, and therefore we can start the list at that point. But just using your time, maybe whether it's your summer between sophomore year and junior year, to just do some what I would call like soft visits, where we're really not worried about how many books are in the library. We're just worried about, is this the type of school that my student would really thrive and do well in? And sometimes we just see the local students, they visit the least because they're like, oh, and let's just use GW for example. A family in Bethesda will be like, well, I've been to see the Lion King at the Kennedy Center, and that's like 100 yards away. But like to actually spend time on that college campus, because before you get on the train to go see NYU, GW could be a good proxy to see if it's worth getting on the train to go see NYU. So that, that's my first piece of advice, is that, you have great schools around you. You don't have to go to that school, but it can just help you refine this process of trying to figure out the type of school that my student would really thrive in.
Yeah, it's great advice. And I want to talk about the tour in a minute. But Rick, so you're going to look at these schools. The question people ask me is like, well, what am I looking for? Like, how do I guide my kid in terms of what they're looking for when they look at these schools? How would you answer that question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing is you're going to show up on these college campuses and they're just going to like pull a string in somebody's back and let them start talking. I mean, that's what admission people do, right? It's going to be a script. It's going to be the canned thing. And they're going to take you on a tour and let you see certain stuff. And they're going to do the exact same thing the next day, like 3 times. So I'd say the most important thing is that you should never even show up on a college campus unless you have a sense of what you want to know. Have a sense of what questions you actually have, what matters to you. Because then if you don't see it or don't get those questions answered during the canned speech, you are going to be proactive to get that answered, right? I think that's really important. And that then might mean sticking around afterwards and asking some questions. It might mean, going on your own over to a certain department, or, seeking out a student or someone else on campus to help you get those questions answered. I agree 100%, I think, with what Ben was saying about like the exposure piece. So there's a lot to be said for that for younger students. But as you get into that junior year, I really think it's so critical to like literally just get out a piece of paper and start to write down some questions that you have, some things that you really feel like you need and want in college, and ask those questions to as many different people as you can, right? Because just because a tour guide says something, or just because a certain professor says something, does not make it like gospel truth for that place. But if you can triangulate a little bit and ask the same questions to multiple people from the same campuses, and then ask those questions you apparently care about at every campus you visit, it's going to be so much of a better opportunity for you to then filter it through when you are in a position to be making decisions about either A, where to apply, or ultimately, all right, now I'm into 3 places. Let me go back to these notes. The other thing I'll just quickly say, I mean, I'm in DC right now. So Ben, I spent the night right by George Washington last night. So Atlanta is very similar to DC, huge, higher education ecosystem. But a lot of people fly into DC or they fly into Atlanta and they like barnstormed through like 13 schools in 3 days, which is, kind of like masochism. But anyway, that's why it's so critical to like actually take notes and compare notes. Like let parents do that, let students do that. But don't just sort of take this stuff for what they give you and walk away, because it will all start to really blur together.
Yeah. So, Aaron, how do you define a balanced list? You were saying you were talking to some students earlier. You were also talking about just the huge increase in applications at a place like Florida State. Like, given how much things are changing from year to year, how do you define a balanced list, and how can kind of parents and students, I know there's no guarantees in this world, but ensure that their list is properly balanced?
Yeah, so to go back kind of what we were talking about earlier, it's lists are balanced when it covers both a range of selectivity levels, but also financial commitment levels. So that's one key thing. But balanced lists also kind of have you keeping an open mind. Like you can have a dream school, but make sure it's a healthy dream because there are so many things in this process that are outside of your control. So avoid limiting yourself early on. And understanding that the best school or what a good school is all relative because there is no definitive best anything in this space. So that's kind of what a start of the balance list. That balance list is going to have to be balanced for you specifically and your interests and your hopes and dreams and what excites you. And that can be in a whole variety of areas. So I'd say you have to kind of keep an open mind to that. And really list is balanced when you're happy and excited to go to any of the schools on that list that you might get into.
I think that's a critical point. Love your list. You could have a priority of them, but make sure you like number one. If it's a list in priority order, number one as much as number 10, or number 10, I should say, as not much as number one. I think that's important.
Sure.
Yes, Rick, go ahead.
Can I just add one thing to what, I people say balanced list a lot, but I just want to just add there. You don't have to apply to a school that denies a lot of kids. Like,
Right.
Nobody said you have to do that. If the schools you love, like Aaron said, the ones that are financially a good fit for you, like if they're all 50+% admit rates, which let's be honest, the majority of schools in the country are, good. Don't go searching for schools that deny thousands of kids just because somebody told you need to balance it out.
That's a great point. So I'm going to ask one question to all three of you quickly, or lightning round. Then I'm going to turn it over to Michael, back to Michael, our moderator, who has some Q&A, I know, from the audience. So question on the tours. You all have made reference to tours. How can you get most out of the college tour? What question, I should say, should everybody ask on the tour? I know parents don't like to ask questions usually, but what's the one question you would ask if you went on a tour? Let's start with you, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, so the secret here is the tour is a trick to get you to engage with one of our current students, right? We just want you to be talking to our students so you can understand their life, understand what excites them about their school, what opportunities they've taken advantage of. While there are bullet points that they're going to go through in these tour stops, I expect you to remember none of them. But I do hope you gain an understanding of your tour guide's experience at the school and kind of what level of customization they've brought to it. I think it's always helpful to ask them questions about their relationships with faculty members. Schools will have a student faculty ratio, but quite honestly, that number can be meaningless and disconnected from the actual experience. And so, you want to kind of probe in terms of the approachability of their faculty members, what happens, when the student gets over their head. Let's be honest, college is hard. And so, what does that support look like? If they miss something in lecture, they just didn't grasp that topic, what resource sources, what's around them, I think is very helpful. But, just again, be the family at the front of the tour, not the back of the tour.
Okay, that's a good one. Just quickly, Aaron and Rick, how do you get most out of the college tour? What's the one question you would ask?
I'm gonna
let's start with you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna not follow directions and say the question that I don't think you should ask. And it would start with just don't ask somebody on the tour or at the college if a program is good there. I get that one a lot. Like, is X, Y, and Z major good here? no campus employee, especially in admissions, is going to be like, no, it's bad here, you should go somewhere else. So part of that's trying to be more specific about your questions. But I think the entire purpose of a college tour is to try and understand the culture of an institution, and whether you ask that question directly or identify those questions for you that help you get at what that culture is to you. And I think that that's an important thing to do, both from how the school portrays itself and what real students say it's like there. I think that's an important distinction to make. But it's important for you to know, like, is the school that you're at, is it kind of the nurturing and supportive school, or is it like competitive and quote unquote elite? Does it have a vibrant student life, if that's something that matters to you? Is it environmentally conscious? Does it really value specialization or lean into more interdisciplinary work for people that have like a lot of interests that are across a broad range of fields? There's a lot of really great schools, but they all have very distinct missions and cultures. And I think that's what you use the campus tour to figure out.
Okay, Rick, I want to make sure we get to some Q&A. So quickly, what's
Yeah.
the one question you think they definitely should ask?
Yep. So to hit on what Aaron said there, like, don't ask website questions. Don't waste your time while you're there with things you could have gotten offline. I would say the question I would try to challenge people to ask is, what are you most excited about, or what's kind of the coolest part about this place? What has surprised you, and what do you wish was different? I think those three questions, if you can get a faculty member, a young alum, a student to answer those questions at each school, would be interesting, right? Because then you can start to get a sense of culture and draw a thread.
Love that. Love that. Michael, I'm going to turn it back to you, and we'll spend the next couple of minutes closing out the webinar, but also getting through some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a lot of great questions, and we may go a couple minutes over, so stick with us as we get into the questions, but a lot of information. I do want to make sure that we cover very quickly Huntington Test Prep, which is is very nationally well known. I mentioned before that on average, you're looking at an increase of 229 points on the SAT and 5.4 points on the SAT. And I think a big part of our success with this program is we start off by doing a comprehensive evaluation, a full practice test. We're looking at really pinpointing strengths and weaknesses so we can design that program, tailor it to the student's abilities and goals. And really, we want to talk about your goals too, right? And I think that's a really important part of this process. And then we develop a personalized exam prep plan based upon the results, based upon your time schedule, right? Because we have people come in, they're really far ahead of the game. And then when people say, look, I got to do this and I've only got X number of weeks. So we're flexible. We try to do everything that we can to make sure that we get the program that you need. So take a look at huntingtonhelps.com. And now let's get into our Q&A. One thing that I will ask right out of the gate before I dive into some of these questions is, Ben, you talked a little bit about the sampling schools in your backyard, and I think that that makes a lot of sense. But is there an optimal time to do that? I mean, should parents be thinking about, oh, this is something I should be putting on my calendar for freshman or sophomore year, or is it just just do it when you have that time? What's your recommendation? And I'll ask that for all three of you.
Yeah, I think for the initial sampling, quite honestly, this can begin as simple as freshman, sophomore year, but in a very low stakes environment. Like, you're already on a trip to see family, you're on a vacation, and you're just going to spend a half day exploring a college. So it's not like we've, loaded the car up to do our college road trip, right? You will have an experience where your student gets out of the car, steps foot on campus for 10 minutes and says, nope, this is not the school for me. And as a parent, you're going to be like, well, we're doing this tour because we just drove 3 hours to be there. But your student is not going to go to that college. And that can be a very tense moment for your family. So doing some of those first ones where it's not a college trip, but instead we're already in this area, let's just go see the school, right? And it's a half-hour presentation, 1 hour tour, and then we're going to get snack afterwards, just to ease into it. And so, I mean, I think that's kind of how you approach it. You're freshman year, sophomore year, even going into your junior fall. It's typically junior spring is when it gets a little bit more serious and you're thinking about how we're going to use that spring break and things like that.
Great. Erin, any thoughts as far as when you should start sampling schools?
I think Ben hit on the head of starting with sort of the low stakes things. Go when it's convenient at the beginning, especially knowing that your world and opportunities of colleges can be spread all over the country. One thing I will say is to take advantage of virtual offerings. A lot of schools did really have to expand their virtual tour offerings during COVID, and I think that ended up being a real benefit to students as they start making their early lists.
Great. And I know Jeff and a couple of you have a hard stop, so we're not going to be able to go over. So I do want to ask maybe one or two more questions, but then I want to get from all of you just what are your key takeaways about this process as far as the college admissions process. So let me just ask another quick question, and then Rick, you can start off with this one. A couple people on the question panel have asked about internships and the value that they have. And I know that I didn't start doing internships until I was in college. And Ben, I did an internship at the National Security Archive, which is based over at George Washington University. So how important are internships, or is that something that you really look at in the admissions process? Give us a feel about that. And Rick, if you don't mind kicking that off. Rick, you're on mute. Erin, why don't we jump to you real quick as far as internships?
Yeah, I mean, we like seeing you do something outside of the classroom, and internships are great, employment is great, clubs, sports, music. It's really just trying to get an idea of both what you're interested in, how you manage, kind of multiple, sometimes competing priorities, and how you spend your time, balance your time, how you learn to be a good community member. And so we like internships. We like all the things, basically. Yeah. And we like prolonged engagement if at all possible. People talk about leadership a lot, but not everybody can be the vice president, historian, secretary of every club or organization. So one thing that we look at too is also your ability to be interested and sustain involvement in something.
Okay, great. Now we've only got a couple minutes left, so why don't we just dive right in and just have everybody, starting with you, Rick, if you're back with us. A couple of key takeaways, right? So we've covered an enormous amount of material over the course of this webinar. So what are a couple of key takeaways for parents to make the most of their college search?
Yeah, sorry, I did go out there briefly. Sorry about that. I think here's the quick two things I would say. For students, I think the big thing is, and we've hit on this several times, but like the goal is, look, there's 4,000 schools in this one small country of ours. You're going to eliminate 3,990 of those. So ultimately, none of the 10 or 11 or whatever your number is that you apply to should be one you wouldn't actually go to. That just doesn't make any sense. But yet somehow, and some reason, some students apply to places that they get into and then say, yeah, but I wouldn't really go there. Don't be that kid. And then I think the other thing, for parents, I mean, my big sort of sky banner message is parents of high school students should talk to fewer parents of other high school students about college admission, and more parents of current college students and recent college grads, because parents of other high school students, they lie, right? They exaggerate, they make up stuff. The school down the street is not only easier, but they admit everybody from there, and there's always a school down the street. And then, parents of current college students and recent college grads tell different stories, right? I mean, what they don't say is, I wish that when my kid was in high school, I would have stressed about all this more, drank more, bit my nails more, slept less. Instead, what they say is like, it worked out, like we never thought he would go there, but he loves it. And
Yeah.
she's dating a guy that we like and has an internship. So, I mean, I think that, we never do that when our kids are 3 and 5, when we're trying to potty train them or teach them to read. Like, we talk to people that are a chapter ahead, but we forget to do that when our kids are in high school. And I think we should just talk to them about the tennis match and not college admission.
Great. So we'll go Ben, Aaron, and then Jeff to wrap up. Just a quick takeaway, making the most of the college search.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we don't talk about as much, but is a responsibility of us as parents in this process, is to help your students process disappointing news.
Yeah.
That your students will build a list. They will not always get the answer that they're looking for. We don't want to dwell on that. We want to help them process that information and then help them celebrate all the other good opportunities that are in front of them. Sometimes we put a particular school on a pedestal, and that can really do a lot of damage to the process. And again, I think it's just, this will not be the first time in your student's life that they have to process bad news, but it is often one of the first high stakes ones. And I think it's a really important life lesson, and how we do that, and how we do that with grace.
Great. Let's actually go to Jeff, then Aaron. Aaron, you can close this out. I know Jeff's got to run. So Jeff, what's a key takeaway or a couple of takeaways making the most of the college search?
So I first of all, I love Rick's suggestion. Stop talking to other high school parents, talk to people who've actually been through the process, and have seen the other side of it, right? With college graduates. I think that's even a better one because they've been through all 4 years. Also, put this in perspective. I think anybody on this call who's been to college themselves knows college is an important moment in life. There's no doubt about it. But it's one moment in life. And there's a lot of other moments in life. There's other staging grounds where you're going to be making changes in your life. College is not the only one of them. It doesn't make or break your life. And I think we need to put that into perspective.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Aaron, take us home. What are a couple of key takeaways as far as making the most of the college search?
Yeah, I'm going to end with the highly academic thought of just chill out, and having that idea and that just settle in that knowledge that there is a place for you and your student and there is a path for you. So be driven, be focused, do your best, be intentional in this process, but also don't forget to be yourself and be a real, genuine human who does things that you're intrinsically motivated to do. Do things for yourself and not for this college goal, this achievement, if you will, because it's a somewhat artificial construct, even if it is a very important step. So that's the final word. Chill out.
That's great advice. That's great advice. So Rick, Aaron, Ben, Jeff, thank you all so much for participating. And I think there's a lot of great information. And I will be honest, we would probably be able to do this Q&A for another hour. There are a lot of questions, so keep your inboxes ready, because we'll send these questions out to you so you can take a look at them and see how we can maybe respond to some of these folks after the webinar. But this is going to conclude our event. But you can see on the screen we have our link to where we post all of our webinars, huntingtonhelps.com/webinars. Like I said before, we are going to send out an email in about a day or two with a link to access the on-demand. But if you don't see that link in your inbox for whatever reason, just go to huntingtonhelps.com, look at the resources section for webinars, or just go to that link there. Of course, as always, we recommend you reach out to Jeff. You got his social media handles for both Twitter, or X as they call it now, and Instagram, and you can of course reach him through his website. But on behalf of Huntington Learning Center and our speakers today, I want to thank you again for your time. That concludes today's event. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.